Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Forbes. Well, welcome, Steve, and thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Jamie. Thank you.
Great to be with you. So I'm going to jump right into some of the questions today. I think a good starting point is pretty much this past year of the pandemic. Allow me to focus on your participation with Forbes, your leadership, the things you witnessed businesses do, and how others were affected by COVID. And so first, COVID-19 greatly disrupted businesses around the world. Travel, dining, sports, you name it. And the duration was a surprise, I know, to many business executives. We've all done pandemic desktop sessions and talked about it, but who was to think it would last more than a year? What adaptations, technologies, or policies helped businesses survive, in your opinion, or even thrive amidst this greatest critical event of our generation?
Well, you're right about the duration. When we all had the lockdowns in the U.S. Back in March, we all thought, oh, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then things would start to unwind. Who knew that a year later we'd be thinking, things are starting to really unwind and we can get back to things more normal. But what you saw unfold is extraordinary versatility of companies in crisis when no one anticipated what was going to happen, the magnitude of it or the duration of it. But it's amazing how companies responded in terms of trying to get through it and in trying to help people get through it. Numerous examples are out there. A company called Red Roof Hotels decided to rent their rooms on a day basis for people working out of their homes. And so you wouldn't spend the night there, but they had the facilities where you could work as if you're in a private office. You saw companies like Walgreens team up with others to deliver groceries and personal care products. Denny's, a fast food restaurant, went into the delivery business, came up with packages with recipes and ingredients, and had them delivered to people. You saw grocery stores like Whole Foods. For a while, people weren't allowed into the stores, so they used that space as fulfillment centers. And so this kind of versatility, GM famously with the ventilators, fashion companies with masks and the like. So distillers coming up with the hand sanitizers. So the ability of businesses to respond creatively was astonishing. In New York City, restaurants being able to put facilities on the sidewalk, even as if you couldn't go inside the restaurant itself, helped keep a lot of companies in that industry that was particularly severely battered, enabling some of them to survive the storm. So I think we can take real pride, most famously, of course, with the pharmaceutical industry, which came up with vaccines. I think the previous record was for mumps, which took 4 years. In this case, they were able to do it in a matter of months. And the technology that a company like Moderna used, that shows the importance of long-term investment. Moderna and some others had been doing real research on the technology that it enabled to the so-called mRNA, a new kind of vaccine. That tech they didn't know was going to be for COVID-19. But they've been working on that technology for several years. So they're able to use that basis, that foundation, to respond and literally save millions of lives by getting those vaccines out far sooner than anyone would have thought possible.
Yeah, great examples of change across the entire spectrum. So on that similar note, but focus now on maybe C-level executives, a space you're very familiar with, do you think the sense of duty of care for employees, because this affected not only business operations, but right down to the individual employees, and you're famous for talking about how important people are to make the organization work. Do you think their duty of care changed for C-level executives during the pandemic, and maybe some examples of how, if you do?
I think what you saw was an intensification of the need to work with people. You couldn't bring them in anymore. You had to start doing operations on a scale never before remotely. And you also have a generation of younger workers coming along who, when they work for a company, many of them just don't want to see it as a 9-to-5 job. They want to get involved in community. They want to get involved in other projects. And so we at Forbes give time off, where if you wanted to do something, either in politics on your own time, or get involved in community projects or charitable organizations, you could do so. So people, the smart C executives, realize that people want to see a purpose. And this gets to the importance of cultivating a culture that people feel that they can believe in. And it's not just mouthing the words, it's the actions of C-level executives and team leaders that will enable people to judge, is this for real or is it just for a public display? So I think it intensified something that had been building before, but put it really, as you may say, on warp speed. And in terms of the changing nature of the economy, well before the pandemic, of course, was the rise of the so-called gig economy, where people were working on their own, not just as Uber drivers and the like, but in a whole array of things, whole array of activities, where you might work for a company for a short while and then go work elsewhere, or where you might on your own have several clients working where you're doing various projects. And so how you treat the gig workers so you can attract that kind of talent. So the workplace is changing, not just in terms of working at home and the hybrid things that we're going to have to be doing in the future, but also in the nature of people who do not want to work by choice the way their parents and grandparents did, where you go to a company and that's that. They want a little bit of diversity in terms of how they do their own, how they develop their own talents and careers.
Yeah, that's a great piece, and I guess maybe a follow-on question would be, through COVID-19, what are some of the things you're most proud of as an organization in that during this global crisis? Any specific examples of things that Forbes did that you're?
Well, I think in terms of recognizing, as we are doing before COVID, that people want that sense of purpose and the ability to do things, not just the job itself, but they think being involved in community projects enhances their own capabilities, getting them out of making sure that things do not become a rut. But in terms of response, Forbes does a lot of live events, and it was a big source of revenue. Well, 2020, obviously those went out the window, and many of them are still just beginning to show signs of life. What do? Well, our teams came up with ways and convinced companies to do numerous one-on virtual events. So we ended up doing over 100 virtual events that worked very successfully. And one of the things we found was that, yes, you couldn't bring people physically together, but sometimes it was easier to bring people you wanted to tap into virtually, instead of them having to go to an airport and go through all the rigmarole of physically arriving someplace. And because of the nature of the COVID crisis, people understood why that was a legitimate thing to do. So we ended up, after a very rough March and April, where it looked like the world was coming to an end because everyone was just pulling back until we got the government programs in place and people started to make adjustments, we ended up having a very strong year, and we ended up hiring people. Our newsroom actually, I think we're one of the only media companies where our newsroom expanded as the year wore on. And in terms of diversity, by going out and searching for talent, 45% of the new hires would be part of diversity. So responding to a crisis in an innovative way, remembering what our purpose is, we are able to not only survive, but actually thrive in responding to a crisis. And that's what management is about. It's not by a rigid playbook, paint by the numbers. Things are going to happen, both good and bad, and you have to know how to do it in a way in which you can try to make the best of it and even use it as an opportunity to do things you hadn't thought of before, or on a scale you hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, certainly good points and comparisons to past. That's a Forbes view. Any comment on how the COVID-19 may have changed your personal style of leadership or your ability to communicate and do things differently? Is there something that or allowed you to change in terms of?
Well, I think what in terms of if you're in a position of responsibility is sometimes the principles may remain the same, but circumstances change. And one of the effectiveness of being a person where you have real responsibilities, a leader, is you have to adjust to a changing environment. You have to adjust to changing needs and wants, not only of your clients and customers, but also the people who are carrying out the mission of your company, of your organization. Great management guru who wrote books that are still read in business schools today like to say that every organization should occasionally, whether they're business, profit, nonprofit, whatever, should ask itself, what is your purpose? What is your mission? What is it that you are trying to do? If you constantly ask yourself that, you get less hung up, less frightened when the means to achieve those goals, that mission may change, or readjusting the focus of an organization. So it's both having that sense of purpose and direction, but also a greater and deeper sense of adaptability and tolerance for the way things may change. And so on my side, recognizing that younger people do want to do things as part of the job that wouldn't have been considered part of a job several years ago. Okay, the virtue of free markets, the virtue of capitalism is you're there to meet the needs and wants of others, and if the means to do it may evolve or change, you don't shake your head at it. You try to figure out, okay, let's make this work. And that way you bring out you are able to attract good people, as I think we did in the past year, and also be able to do a better job in the future. So the way I had looked at a workforce has changed. I think that's true of everyone. Your part of your effectiveness comes from input and observing and trying to figure out how to move things forward without thinking you have all the answers. And so whether you're 34 or 74 or 124, the ability to realize people's needs and wants may change. And if you want to get a job done, you better recognize that and not only just accept it, but learn to nurture it and bring out the best of it.
Well, yeah, we certainly agree that are hallmarks of getting through COVID, especially in leadership style. So thanks for that insight. I think, both Forbes and Everbridge remain trusted sources of information. Companies can continue to play a greater role to support open communications and resiliency in crisis.
That is true, and again, it is one of the things I think we do in terms of communications is not just getting out information on the website, but these virtual events I talked about. Hopefully, we're going to have more physical events in the future. But whether it's our 30 under 30, these are young people around the world doing various astonishing things at a young age, or whether we also have 50 over 50 people who are a little older doing amazing things, recalibrating, doing some extraordinary things. One of the things we tend to forget is that the average age of an entrepreneur is not 22. The average age is 39. And that people often come out of large companies who end up starting companies. So one of the things about events is brainstorming. I think you found this in some of your meetings in the past, get-togethers in the past. People want to talk to other people, not just share information, but learn. Oh, how did you cope with this? What can I learn? And get out of our daily routine and exchange that information. And so brainstorming, coming together, it goes back to European merchant fairs 800 years ago. People want to come together. So it's going to be both virtual and we recognize physically getting together, where you have those kinds of serendipitous things. You hear something, you talk to somebody about something you hadn't anticipated, and by golly, can make a real difference.
Absolutely, and thematically, data and news, and for this audience, a lot of executives, C-level executives, but also a lot of public safety officials, government officials, where data and news are so important to inform them during a crisis. In fact, as we go forward, maybe help us understand your view of the more fragmented and remote media and reporting structures where newsrooms of the past have dissipated. How do you feel about the industry coming together across a global audience and building unity and consistency in the this authenticity of their journalistic practices and the news they deliver, given its...
Well, what you have found, certainly in the United States, is a plummet in trust in media. And having grown up in the industry, I don't like that trend at all. But what this emphasizes is we now have more sources of information than ever before. And not just being able to go online, but people recognize that you don't have to be a journalist to have useful information. You might be an expert in a certain aspect of accounting. That certain people would want to have access to that information. So we have online over 3,000 contracted contributors writing about areas in their expertise that people out. And this gets to something that gets what they call it, a culture of an organization, whatever name you want to give to it. It gets to trust. When you go to a site or you go to a source of information, can you trust that that information is something that you can use, that you don't have to put it through a filter or wonder what is their agenda? So it's not just global or across nation organizations recognizing that ultimately their success depends, as they say in politics, on the consent of in politics, they say consent of the governed in democratic nations, but in terms of journalism, consent of those who believe that you are providing them with useful information. So there, it's all about brand building and people realizing, well, you have a unique purpose, and that you understand what their needs are, and you are finding ways to provide them with those needs, whether it's direct information or, as I mentioned, physically getting together in various sessions where not only do you hear from recognized people, experts and the like, but also interacting with your peers that can be absolutely invaluable.
Great insight. Allow me to stay on the same topic for kind of both the government participants that we often have in these seminars, and turn to public and private cooperation. If we're to go back in time to say March 2020, knowing what we know now, what do you believe could be done on the public-private sectors to improve the outcomes for businesses during the pandemic? And specifically, have you seen any examples of these that have been successful throughout this COVID-19 pandemic?
The key thing about organizations is to recognize that organizations left to themselves, this is true no matter what area it is in, culture, museums, businesses, government, highway building, whatever it is, you tend to become inward looking. We see it in business all the time. And then you get upended by an entrepreneur doing something entirely new or doing something so much better. I remember growing up where Xerox was the great copier company, and then other companies figured out how to do a small, cheap copiers. You didn't have to have a big one, how disruptive that was. So the key thing is, one of the things we learned is that some of our health organizations were very slow in responding. They saw a crisis coming, but they couldn't break out of the way they had always done things. And so we had bad delays in creating tests back in February and March of 2020, before CDC and FDA realized you got to bring in the private sector, you got to learn to tap all resources that you can. We have an emergency. What I hope that comes out of this, especially given the cooperation that did develop with our pharmaceutical companies and government, where government agreed to help do something that had never been done before, where you're developing a new drug, a vaccine, and you're building the manufacturing facilities at the same time, even though you're not sure whether this thing is going to work. Normally, you would do the testing, which takes years, and then you would do the manufacturing, which is why it takes so long normally to do these things. I hope that but in this emergency, this was the most wonderful example where both sides ended up in harness and got the job done. And so going into the future, I think one of the things we have to learn, but whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, is not get stuck, and you emphasize this with your own clients, not get stuck in a silo. And always keep the lines of communication, interactivity. So one, you remind yourself of what your purpose is. You may mouth the words, but it's got to be re-intensified. And also tapping into areas outside of your normal areas of interaction. I'll give you just one example. Years ago, the American military realized that if it was going to have an effective officer corps, it needed people who wouldn't get stuck in a rut, that they just saw things a certain way. And so one of the things that happens in our armed forces is if you rise up, you're an officer and you're rising up in rank, at some point, you're expected to go back to college and get a master's degree or a doctorate in a certain area. A friend of our family, a graduate of West Point, got a doctorate from MIT, biotechnology or some area like that, so that you go out of your daily routine and get exposed to something that both expands your capabilities, but also your horizons, so you don't get this narrow focus. And suddenly when something changes, and things always change, you don't have the mental acuity and versatility to respond to it. So those kind of programs like the military did, you've got to go out and go back to school and get an expanded area of expertise. I think you're going to see that more and more in businesses, especially with online learning, where you can do things more easily rather than physically sitting in a classroom, getting new areas of expertise and making sure you don't go to be using an old world, you don't go stale, either as a person or as an organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us can agree we're all beneficiaries, whether it's GM, as you mentioned, coming up with ventilators, or it's Moderna or Pfizer coming together with the government to put out vaccines at a world record for all of our benefit. Those are private and public cooperation areas that we'd love to see more of if we can get that same result. So great insight there. Now, perhaps allow me, Steve, to move to the topic of things learned in moving forward, as we begin to move into a period where we expect to have closer and closer to some level of herd immunity we've heard about. Maybe a few questions on the things that businesses may have learned and what you think about the new normal or the move forward. And I'd start by just asking, what are the biggest lessons learned by C-level executives from the pandemic? And do you think that they're going to have a new appreciation of critical events and the impact they can have on their businesses?
I think the question answers itself. Critical events, we tended to think before COVID that would be something more to a particular company or a particular area that get hits with a natural disaster or something like that. But that in the world we live in, you can get surprise hits no matter what the source, and the magnitude can be very serious. So I think companies have a new appreciation of preparedness on that. Upping the game in terms of risk insurance. It's not just a technical issue, it's something that the whole organization has to be accustomed to, and not just certain segments of it, but also how fast and quick you can do things. I think people got a new appreciation. Don't say it can't be done or it hasn't been done before. That may be true, but a sign of a creative organization is, okay, we have a certain area of expertise. How do we funnel it in a way that we hadn't thought of before? And so I think a lot of smart executives and entrepreneurs are saying, okay, COVID was a crisis that, in effect, forced a lot of companies to do these things. How about doing it in a non-crisis atmosphere? So we're ready for disruption, but also appreciation of how the talents we have, the capabilities we have inside can be deployed in areas we hadn't thought of before, like a red roof providing facilities for people who want a place to do day work and things like that. And so I think the smart ones are scratching their heads and saying, okay, how do we take what we had to do under crisis and do it as an opportunity in more normal times?
Great. So speaking about that core resource that makes that change, the topic of people, I directly have experienced this throughout COVID. I have one younger son that's just approaching the workforce. He is very much interested in experiencing the culture and the social elements of returning to work. On the other hand, I, as a little bit more senior, am quite comfortable with the flexibility given to me by doing things over a Zoom or not necessarily being in the office every day. Looking beyond 2021 and even in the future, what does the future of work look like? And how does this concept of office change? Even how do you manage people differently in this new environment?
Well, I think it's becoming very clear even before COVID, and COVID put this under a real intensity, is that the key thing is, what is the job you need to get done? And the ways that we thought we had to do it before, well, it turns out maybe we don't have to do it that way before. So a company like Epic Systems, they feel that it's very important for brainstorming and the like to have people physically present. Other companies like Forbes are going to have hybrid methods of doing things. Journalism is a different field, information communications, high tech. So our people be doing all of the above. And in terms of managers, in terms of people leading teams, you have to figure out constantly, especially for projects, what's the best way to proceed on this particular thing. It may be apt for a particular situation. It may not be apt for another situation. So the real pressure is going to be on managers as never before. Management has always been an art, but it's going to be more of an art than ever before, because in effect you have to recreate the wheel for each project or for a new undertaking that you hadn't experienced before like that. So versatility and the ability to use tools and talents that you hadn't thought of before are going to be at a premium. Innovation is going to be at a premium. And that people want stability in their own work, whether it's working at home, maybe it's being a gig worker, doing 4 days a week in the office and maybe 1 day on the road and maybe on the weekends doing something else. You have to recognize people are going to be doing things very differently. It's not going to be one size fits all. The only thing that changes the job done, the way it gets done, is going to be an evolving picture, many moving parts.
Again, we hear those insightful words and the kind of watchwords from you, which are, open to change and flexibility because it's a new world. So thank you for those. As you look ahead for kind of the C-level suite, how do you think people are going to deal with the fact that, in the old world, you'd come to an office building, you'd come to a plant, you were there. It was pretty easy to secure them. Now they're, so to speak, out in the wild. They're distributed. I think in journalism, you probably have more of that. But how do you think people are going to think about the threats against their people and these increasing cyber risk that you have when you have a diversified systems environment? How do you think about that in the future?
Well, what has been emphasized, I think, by what has been happening is not only legacy businesses, but all kinds of businesses are open to these kinds of serious disruptions, whether deliberate or not. And I think that puts a premium on those who are in the business of responding to these crises, these emergencies, that the ability to do so in a very precise, almost laser-like way, a versatile way, instead of doing all of one thing or all of another thing. I think that ability to respond to the particular crisis is going to be more important than ever before. So those kinds of software are going to be in demand as never before. And I think you're going to see enormous growth in Everbridge and those who wish to compete in terms of being able to respond to a crisis in a finite way instead of a one-size-fits-all way.
Other topic of kind of business disruption, any things that you'd suggest executives, even public safety officials or government leaders need to think about major disruption so they're a little bit ahead of the curve?
Well, the key thing is always taking the time to ask and bring people together, what if? And then examining their answers. Are they real answers, or are they just filling out pieces of paper? For example, before COVID-19, there had been some examinations of how to respond to a pandemic. And it turns out that all those learned papers, at the end of the day, were pretty useless. And so C-level executives have to ask not only what if, but also have to say, well, show us that this is a likely crisis and why this will work, why this will be effective. So the pressure on C-level executives is going to be more intense because they not only have to say, are we doing something about it, but know how to ask the questions to probe, are people focusing on the right areas and providing responses that will truly be effective. That's the kind of thing that is going to keep you up at night. But as they say, we live in an era where you can either eat well or do well. The eat well, I have no problem with. You can eat well or sleep well. You can't do both. Eat well or sleep well. So the eating part I have no problem with, but the sleep part, that's what leaders are paid for.
Well, and maybe turning to a positive final question, on a positive note, what gives you hope for the future of global business post-pandemic?
Well, the very fact that how well so many businesses responded and did things knowing that even they would have thought possible, I think shows the spirit of innovation, creativity, versatility is very, very powerful. And so as long as we provide an environment where that talent can be recognized, developed, where people can make mistakes and learn from their mistakes, and we don't put artificial barriers in the way of people doing things, you get people from the most unlikely backgrounds ending up doing great things, then the world will be a better place. The talent is there. The question is, are we creating an environment where that talent can be discovered and then be allowed to flourish?
Well, on that positive note, I'm going to bring this session to an end with our distinguished guest, Mr. Steve Forbes, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief of Forbes Media. Thank you, Steve, for your insight and for the time you spent with our attendees. I know I appreciate it, and I'm sure they do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for all you're doing. Thank you.